Far to the north, beyond the edges of familiar maps, there is a place where sound seems to vanish, a place where the wind moves slowly, dragging itself across ice that has not changed for centuries. The sky there feels wider than elsewhere. Time feels heavier. In this quiet world of white horizons and frozen seas, 2 ships once disappeared. They did not vanish suddenly. There was no single moment of disaster, no great storm recorded, no final signal sent home. Instead, the Franklin expedition faded slowly into silence. Tonight, we will tell this story gently. Not as a tale of shock or spectacle, but as a calm unfolding of events. A mystery shaped by patience, confidence, and the limits of human planning. A story meant to be listened to slowly, perhaps as you rest, perhaps as you drift toward sleep. In the middle of the 19th century, the world was changing rapidly. Steam engines powered cities. Railways crossed landscapes that once took weeks to traverse. Factories produced goods at a pace that seemed unstoppable. In Britain, there was a growing belief that every corner of the world could be reached, measured, and mastered. Maps were being filled in. Blank spaces were shrinking. And yet, one vast region remained stubbornly incomplete: the Arctic. At the top of the world lay a maze of ice-choked channels and frozen seas. Somewhere among them, it was believed, existed a navigable route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This route was known as the Northwest Passage. Finding it was not just a matter of geography, it was a matter of national pride. A successful passage would mean faster trade, global influence, and proof that modern technology could overcome even the harshest environments. By the 1840s, Britain had already sent many expeditions north. Some returned with new maps. Some returned with stories of unimaginable cold and endless darkness. A few did not return at all, and yet optimism remained. Ships were stronger now. Navigation was more precise. Food could be preserved in metal cans, sealed tight against spoilage. Scientific instruments promised better understanding of weather, magnetism, and ice. The Arctic, many believed, was no longer unknowable. It was into this atmosphere of confidence that Sir John Franklin prepared his final voyage. Franklin was not a reckless man. He was experienced, methodical, and widely respected. He had already survived earlier Arctic journeys, some of them brutal. He understood cold, hunger, and endurance. By the time he was chosen to lead this expedition, Franklin was nearing 60. To many, his age represented wisdom rather than weakness. He was seen as steady, dependable, a safe choice for a dangerous mission. The expedition he would command was impressive by the standards of its time. 2 ships were selected: HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. They were not fragile wooden vessels meant for warm seas. They were reinforced with iron. Their bows were strengthened to push through ice. Inside, they carried innovations meant to make Arctic life manageable: heating systems, desalination equipment, large libraries for the crew, thousands of tins of preserved food. Everything suggested preparedness. When the ships departed England in the spring of 1845, crowds gathered to watch. Families waved from shore. Officials spoke with confidence. This was not presented as a gamble. It was presented as a certainty. The last confirmed sighting of the expedition came later that summer. The ships were seen by whalers in Baffin Bay, moving steadily northward. The men aboard were reported to be in good spirits, healthy, optimistic. Then nothing. Seasons passed. Winter came and went. No letters arrived, no reports returned. At first, this absence did not cause alarm. Arctic expeditions were expected to be silent for years at a time. The ice dictated schedules, not governments. But as more time passed, concern began to grow. When relief expeditions were finally sent north, they found no ships waiting to be rescued, no camps signaling survival, only ice and silence. What followed was one of the longest and most haunting search efforts in the history of exploration. Over the following decades, dozens of expeditions would comb the Arctic. They would find fragments. A spoon here, a boot there, a single note written carefully on official paper left behind in a stone cairn. Each discovery answered one small question while opening several more. Why had the ships become trapped? Why had the men abandoned them? How far had they traveled on foot? What, exactly, caused their deaths? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, how could such a well-equipped, carefully planned expedition have failed so completely? This story is not about incompetence or arrogance alone. It is about mismatch between expectation and reality, between Victorian confidence and Arctic indifference. The Arctic does not rush. It does not negotiate. It does not reward effort. Ice forms when it will. Darkness arrives without apology. Cold settles into bone and metal alike. In telling this story softly, we allow space for reflection. We allow the events to unfold without forcing meaning onto them. We listen, as those long searches listened, for clues carried quietly across the ice. If you find comfort in slow history like this, you're welcome to rest here with Archive of Rest. There is no urgency tonight, only a story told at its own pace. As we move forward, we will step carefully into the world that shaped the Franklin expedition. We will explore the mindset of the era, the ships themselves, the long waiting seasons in the ice, and the voices, often overlooked, of the Inuit who observed what others could not. This is not a tale of sudden catastrophe. It is a gradual narrowing of possibilities, a slow closing of distance, a mystery that unfolds not in moments but in years. For now, imagine the ships as they were at the beginning, hull and sail intact, supplies neatly stacked, men confident in their purpose. Ahead of them, the Arctic stretches outward, silent, unchanged, waiting. To understand why the Franklin expedition ever set sail, it helps to step back into the world that created it. Not just the year, not just the maps, but the mindset. Mid-19th century Britain was a nation that believed deeply in forward motion. Progress was not a hope, it was an expectation. Factories filled the air with steam and soot. Railway lines cut through countryside that had once seemed timeless. Cities expanded outward and upward, their rhythms driven by clocks rather than seasons. This was an age that trusted systems, an age that believed problems, given enough effort and ingenuity, could always be solved. Exploration fit naturally into this worldview. For centuries, European powers had sent ships across oceans in search of wealth, territory, and knowledge. By the 1800s, much of the world's coastline had been charted. Continents had been crossed, great rivers traced from source to sea. Yet, on British maps, the far north remained unfinished. Above North America stretched a tangled network of islands, straits, and frozen channels. These waters were known to exist, but not to be understood. They were marked with broken lines, uncertain coastlines, and blank interior spaces. This incompleteness was unsettling. In a culture that prized order and classification, blank spaces felt like unfinished work. The Northwest Passage became a kind of obsession, a hypothetical sea route through the Arctic, connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. If navigable, it promised faster trade with Asia and a decisive commercial advantage over rival nations. But beyond economics, the passage carried symbolic weight. To find it would be to prove that no part of the earth lay beyond human reach. British naval culture reinforced this belief. The Royal Navy was not simply a military force. It was a training ground for discipline, endurance, and hierarchy. Officers were taught to observe carefully, record meticulously, and follow procedure even under extreme pressure. Exploration expeditions were often staffed by naval men for this reason. They were expected to obey orders, endure hardship, and document everything they saw. Success was measured not only in distance traveled, but in logs filled, coastlines traced, and specimens collected. By the early 19th century, Arctic exploration had become almost routine. Expeditions set out knowing they might be gone for years. Silence was expected. Delay was normal. Some voyages returned with valuable information. Others returned with little more than confirmation that the ice remained where it had always been. And some did not return at all. Yet each failure was rarely seen as a warning. More often, it was framed as a lesson. The thinking was simple. If one expedition failed, the next would be better prepared. Ships were strengthened. Provisions improved. Clothing adapted. Confidence was cumulative. By the 1840s, British exploration had begun to feel almost procedural. The Arctic was dangerous, yes, but it was no longer mysterious in the way it once had been. It was seen as a problem of logistics rather than survival. This belief was deeply rooted in the era's faith in science. Scientific societies flourished across Britain. Measurements of magnetism, temperature, and atmospheric pressure were treated with near reverence. Knowledge was collected, categorized, and archived. The Arctic offered a perfect laboratory. Here was a region that tested instruments to their limits, a place where magnetism behaved strangely, compasses faltered, and daylight itself disappeared for months at a time. To explore the Arctic was not only to seek a route, it was to gather data. Exploration logs from this period read less like adventure stories and more like scientific reports. Daily temperatures, wind direction, ice thickness. Emotion was often absent from the page, even when circumstances were extreme. This restraint was not accidental. It reflected a cultural value. Stoicism was admired. Endurance was expected. To complain was to fail. Within this context, suffering was often normalized. Frostbite, scurvy, exhaustion, these were hazards of the profession. They were not signs that the mission itself was flawed. This mindset shaped public perception as well. When expeditions were announced, newspapers reported them with pride. Illustrations showed ships cutting confidently through ice, flags flying against dramatic skies. The Arctic was portrayed as severe but conquerable. There was little room in this narrative for uncertainty. And yet, the Arctic itself did not conform to expectations. Ice did not behave predictably. Channels that appeared open one year might freeze solid the next. Seasons varied. Storms came without warning. Indigenous Arctic communities had long understood this variability. They adapted their lives to it, moving with the land and sea rather than against them. But this knowledge was rarely prioritized by European explorers. British expeditions relied instead on charts, instruments, and naval routines developed for very different environments. Wintering in the ice became a standard practice. Ships would allow themselves to become frozen in place, trusting that the ice would release them when summer returned. In many cases, this strategy worked. Crews passed the dark months by maintaining strict schedules. Meals were served at set times. Exercises were enforced. Lectures were given. Order was seen as a defense against despair. The idea that ice might hold ships for multiple years or crush them entirely was considered unlikely. By the time plans were made for the Franklin expedition, Arctic travel had been attempted often enough to seem manageable. Previous expeditions had returned alive. Maps had improved. Supplies were abundant. It felt like the final pieces of the puzzle were within reach. Selecting a leader was therefore a matter of experience rather than daring. Sir John Franklin fit this requirement well. He was not a celebrity adventurer. He was a naval officer shaped by decades of service. His earlier expeditions had tested him harshly, and he had survived. This history reassured both officials and the public. If Franklin had endured before, he could endure again. What few questioned was whether endurance alone was enough. The age of polar exploration was built on accumulation. Each expedition added to a growing body of knowledge. Each success reinforced the belief that mastery was inevitable. But accumulation can create blind spots. When confidence grows gradually, it rarely announces itself as overconfidence. In Britain's case, belief in progress became a lens through which all challenges were viewed. The Arctic was not approached as a living environment with its own rules. It was approached as a final obstacle to be overcome. This distinction matters, because when difficulties arose, solutions were often sought in better equipment rather than different thinking, more insulation, stronger hulls, heavier provisions. Rarely was the underlying assumption questioned, that the Arctic could be navigated like any other ocean. The Franklin expedition emerged from this world fully formed. It was not an anomaly. It was the logical continuation of decades of exploration. Everything about it reflected Victorian confidence, its ships, its leadership, its planning. And this is what makes the story so compelling. Not because it was reckless, but because it was reasonable, by the standards of its time. As the ships prepared to sail, Britain believed it was watching the final chapter of a long effort. The age of polar exploration seemed poised to deliver its ultimate reward. What lay ahead instead was not a dramatic failure, but a quiet unraveling, one that would challenge assumptions not only about the Arctic, but about progress itself. And that unraveling began not in ice or darkness, but here, in drawing rooms and naval offices, in charts spread neatly across tables, in the calm certainty that the world, at last, could be known. By the time Sir John Franklin was chosen to lead the 1845 expedition into the Arctic, he was not a man driven by novelty. He was shaped by routine, by discipline, by long years of service in environments where survival depended on patience more than speed. Sir John Franklin was born in 1786, in a Britain still defined by sail and wooden hulls. He entered the Royal Navy as a boy, at a time when naval life demanded early obedience and quiet endurance. From the beginning, his career followed a steady path. He learned to follow orders precisely, to observe carefully, to accept hardship without complaint. This temperament would define him. Franklin served in the Napoleonic Wars, including the Battle of Trafalgar. These early experiences exposed him to danger, loss, and the rigid structure of naval command. They also taught him something crucial. Survival often depended on maintaining order in situations where chaos was close at hand. When the wars ended, Britain's navy turned outward, once more toward exploration. Franklin, like many officers of his generation, saw this not as a departure from service, but as its continuation. Exploration offered purpose without war. Franklin's first Arctic experience came not by sea, but by land. In 1819, he was selected to lead an overland expedition to chart the northern coast of Canada. This journey would shape his reputation more than any other. The expedition faced extreme conditions almost immediately. Food supplies failed. Weather worsened. Distances were misjudged. The men were reduced to exhaustion and starvation. Several died along the way. Franklin survived, not through brilliance or decisive leadership, but through persistence. He endured hunger that left lasting physical damage. He walked when others could not. He continued when retreat was no longer possible. When he returned to Britain, the public narrative was carefully framed. Franklin was portrayed as heroic, steadfast, and courageous. His suffering was emphasized as proof of character. Privately, the expedition had revealed limitations. Planning had been flawed. Local knowledge had been insufficient. Adaptation had been slow. But these shortcomings were not widely discussed. In the culture of the time, survival itself carried enormous weight. Franklin's reputation grew. He led a second overland expedition in the 1820s, again enduring immense hardship. Again, losses occurred. Again, he returned alive. The pattern reinforced an image of Franklin as a man who could withstand almost anything. This mattered deeply to the Admiralty. Arctic exploration was not looking for brilliance alone. It was looking for reliability, someone who would not panic, someone who would maintain discipline even as conditions deteriorated. Franklin fit this expectation perfectly. By the time he was appointed governor of Van Diemen's Land, present-day Tasmania, Franklin had accumulated decades of administrative and command experience. This role further shaped his leadership style. He governed cautiously. He relied on established systems. He valued procedure. These qualities earned him respect, but also criticism. Some found him slow to adapt, too deferential to authority, uncomfortable with improvisation. And yet, these traits aligned closely with how the Admiralty envisioned Arctic command. The Arctic, in British thinking, was a place where chaos could be managed through structure. Franklin was a man of structure. When plans for a renewed Northwest Passage expedition took shape in the 1840s, Franklin's name returned naturally to the discussion. He was experienced. He had survived the Arctic before. He understood deprivation. His age, nearly 60, was not seen as a disadvantage. In fact, it reassured many. Youth implied risk-taking. Franklin implied caution. There was also a symbolic dimension to his selection. Franklin represented continuity. He connected earlier eras of exploration with the modern, technologically confident present. He had endured old hardships and now commanded new tools. This alignment mattered. The expedition was meant to succeed not through daring, but through preparation. Franklin's leadership style reflected this philosophy. He believed in routines, daily schedules, clear chains of command. He trusted his officers and expected them to follow established protocols. Innovation, when it appeared, was accepted cautiously. This approach had served him well in the past. But the Arctic of 1845 would demand more than endurance. Expectations surrounding Franklin were immense. The public viewed him as a seasoned veteran returning for a final, triumphant chapter. Newspapers framed the expedition as the culmination of his life's work. There was little sense that failure was possible. Franklin himself likely shared this optimism. He had endured worse conditions with fewer resources. Now he commanded 2 reinforced ships, equipped with heating systems and ample provisions. The men under his command were trained, disciplined, and numerous. The confidence was not reckless, it was methodical, but confidence can narrow vision. Franklin's previous experiences had taught him that suffering could be endured. What they had not taught him was when endurance was no longer the correct response. In earlier expeditions, retreat had been impossible. Forward movement, however slow, was the only option. This lesson lingered. The Arctic, however, is not consistent. Sea ice behaves differently from land. Ships cannot simply walk away from danger. They become embedded within it. Franklin's understanding of the Arctic was shaped by a specific set of experiences. They did not encompass every possibility, and yet his authority went unquestioned. Within the Royal Navy's culture, hierarchy was absolute. Decisions flowed downward. Doubt was rarely voiced openly. This structure provided stability, but it also discouraged challenge. Officers under Franklin were competent and capable. Many had Arctic experience of their own. Yet the final authority rested firmly with the commander. Expectations, once set, are difficult to escape. Franklin was expected to succeed because he had survived. He was expected to endure because he always had. The expedition was planned accordingly. There was no serious contingency for total immobilization. No clear protocol for abandoning ships permanently. The assumption was that patience would be enough. Franklin's temperament reinforced this assumption. He was not impulsive. He did not rush decisions. But neither was he inclined to overturn established plans. This balance between caution and rigidity would shape the expedition's fate. It is important to remember that Franklin did not see himself as risking lives unnecessarily. He believed sincerely that he was prepared. His confidence was not arrogance. It was earned, reinforced by years of survival and institutional approval. And this is what makes his role in the Franklin expedition so complex. He was not a reckless adventurer pushing limits for glory. He was a product of his time, of a system that rewarded endurance over adaptability. As the ships sailed north, Franklin carried with him a lifetime of experience. But he also carried expectations, his own and those placed upon him by a nation that believed the Arctic had finally been solved. The ice ahead would test not just his body, but his assumptions, and endurance, once a strength, would slowly become a constraint. For now, though, Franklin stood at the center of the expedition as its steady anchor, a man shaped by past survival, trusted by authority, and confident in preparation. The Arctic waited, not for courage, not for experience, but for understanding. Before the Franklin expedition ever reached the ice, its fate was already bound to 2 ships. They were not symbols at first, they were tools: wood, iron, canvas, and rope, assembled with care and confidence, shaped by decades of naval experience and recent advances in technology. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had histories long before they were assigned to the Arctic. They were not built as exploration vessels. They were bomb ships designed for warfare, their hulls constructed to withstand the recoil of heavy mortars. This origin mattered. Bomb ships were among the strongest wooden vessels in the Royal Navy. Their frames were thick, Their internal bracing was dense. They were meant to absorb shock without breaking apart. When the Navy began adapting ships for polar service, these qualities made bomb ships ideal candidates. Strength, after all, was assumed to be the primary requirement for survival in ice. Both Erebus and Terror had already proven themselves in extreme environments. They had sailed to Antarctica in the 1840s under the command of James Clark Ross, pushing farther south than any ships before them. They had endured storms, ice pressure, and long periods of isolation. They returned from that voyage intact. This success reinforced belief in their suitability. When plans for the Northwest Passage expedition were finalized, these ships were selected not because they were experimental, but because they were trusted. Before departure, they were extensively modified. Their hulls were reinforced with additional timber and iron plating, especially along the bows. The idea was simple. When encountering ice, the ships would push forward rather than splinter. Internally, beams were strengthened. Spaces were reorganized to carry provisions for several years. Every modification reflected a belief in preparation through accumulation. More supplies meant more security. One of the most celebrated additions was the installation of steam-powered engines. These engines were not meant to replace sails, but to supplement them when winds were unfavorable or ice channels narrow. Each ship carried a screw propeller that could be raised out of the water when not in use, protecting it from damage. The engines were powered by coal and connected to systems adapted from railway technology. This hybrid design, sail and steam, represented the cutting edge of naval innovation. It also added complexity. Steam engines required maintenance. They consumed fuel. They produced heat and condensation in an environment where moisture could become dangerous. Still, the presence of engines contributed to a growing sense of confidence. The ships were no longer fully dependent on wind and current. They could, in theory, maneuver with greater control. Heating systems were installed as well. Warm air could be circulated through the lower decks, reducing the risk of frostbite and illness. For men accustomed to earlier Arctic voyages, this seemed revolutionary. No longer would crews sleep in freezing quarters wrapped in damp blankets. Comfort, at least relative comfort, was now possible. The ships also carried desalination equipment, allowing fresh water to be produced from seawater. This reduced reliance on stored supplies and melting ice. Again, each addition removed a point of vulnerability. Provisions filled every available space. Tens of thousands of pounds of food were loaded aboard: salted meat, hardtack, dried vegetables, and, most notably, canned goods. Canning was still a relatively new technology. Food sealed in metal tins promised long shelf life and resistance to spoilage. For Arctic travel, this was considered a breakthrough. The expedition carried several years' worth of canned food, prepared quickly to meet departure schedules. Speed was valued. The assumption was that sealed metal equaled safety. Few paused to consider long-term chemical interactions between food and containers. The technology was trusted because it was modern. The interior spaces of the ships reflected naval order. Sleeping quarters were compact but organized. Hammocks were hung and stowed on strict schedules. Mess areas followed routine. The ships carried libraries, musical instruments, and personal items. Books were selected to educate and entertain. Games were included to maintain morale during the long Arctic winter. These details mattered. The Navy understood that survival was not only physical, it was psychological. Keeping men occupied, maintaining routine, and reinforcing hierarchy were seen as essential defenses against despair. Life aboard the ships was carefully structured. Days were divided by watches. Meals were served at set times. Work and leisure followed predictable patterns. In this way, the ships became floating extensions of British society, self-contained worlds governed by rules, expectations, and tradition. Yet ships, no matter how strong, are not static objects. They respond to their environment. Wood swells and contracts with temperature changes. Iron behaves differently in extreme cold. Steam systems react to pressure and condensation. The Arctic amplified these interactions. Ice pressure was not like waves or storms. It moved slowly, relentlessly, squeezing hulls over days and weeks rather than moments. The reinforced frames of Erebus and Terror were designed to resist impact, but not necessarily prolonged compression. When ice closed around a ship, there was often no sound, no warning. The vessel simply stopped moving. At first, this was not alarming. Becoming icebound was an expected part of Arctic travel. Ships had wintered in ice before and survived. Crews adapted. Snow was banked against hulls for insulation. Tents were erected on the ice. Hunting parties went ashore when possible. The ships became stationary bases rather than vehicles. This shift, from movement to waiting, was central to Arctic expeditions. And Erebus and Terror were equipped for waiting, but waiting is not passive. Supplies are consumed. Engines require upkeep. Morale fluctuates. Over time, small issues compound. Condensation from heating systems dampened interior spaces. Moisture froze in corners and behind walls. Mold and mildew became concerns. Coal supplies diminished. Steam engines were used sparingly to conserve fuel, reducing their practical benefit. The very features designed to ensure safety introduced new dependencies. The ship's strength also worked against them in subtle ways. Their reinforced hulls made them heavy. In shallow or ice-filled waters, this limited maneuverability. Raising and lowering the screw propellers required effort and coordination. Damage to these mechanisms could leave ships partially disabled. Sails, too, were vulnerable. Canvas stiffened in cold. Rigging froze. Handling lines became dangerous. Every action took more time. Every mistake carried greater risk. Still, within the worldview of the time, these were acceptable challenges. The ships were not seen as fragile. They were seen as resilient. Confidence in their design shaped decisions. If ice closed in, the assumption was that patience would prevail, that summer would return, that the ships would be released. This assumption had precedent. What it lacked was humility. The Arctic is not obligated to follow patterns. Ice can hold for 1 year, or many. The ships themselves were silent participants in this unfolding reality. They did not fail dramatically. They did not break apart immediately. They endured. And in enduring, they allowed the expedition to remain in place far longer than human bodies could tolerate. This is one of the quiet ironies of the Franklin expedition. The ships were too successful. Their strength delayed the moment when retreat might have seemed necessary. They offered shelter long after they had ceased to offer escape. Within their hulls, routines continued. Meals were served. Logs were kept. Discipline held. But the ships were no longer moving forward. They had become islands. Islands of wood and iron surrounded by a sea that no longer flowed. As months turned into years, the ship's role changed again. They became burdens. Abandoning them would mean leaving behind warmth, food, and familiarity. Staying with them meant waiting for conditions that might never change. This dilemma was not immediately obvious. It emerged slowly. At first, the ships represented safety, then delay, then uncertainty. The design choices that once seemed so prudent began to reveal their limits. Steam engines could not melt ice fields. Reinforced bows could not negotiate pressure ridges. Stored food could not restore health once illness took hold. The ships had been built to resist the Arctic. But resistance is not the same as adaptation. Erebus and Terror carried the best intentions of their age. They embodied faith in engineering, order, and preparation. They were, in many ways, remarkable vessels, but they were also products of assumptions that the Arctic would behave predictably, and that technology could compensate for any uncertainty. As the expedition progressed, the ships remained where they were placed, slowly becoming part of the frozen landscape. Their decks collected snow. Their masts stood against a sky that did not change. Inside, men continued to trust the structures around them. Outside, the ice tightened, and in that narrowing space between design and reality, the true challenge of the Franklin expedition began to take shape. The transition from open sea to ice is rarely dramatic at first. There is no clear boundary, no sudden wall. Instead, the water changes texture. Small fragments appear. Thin sheets, scattered flows, pale shapes drifting quietly past the hull. For the men aboard the two ships, this early ice did not inspire fear. It inspired focus. They had expected this moment. They had trained for it. Charts had shown where the ice would likely begin, and the season was considered favorable. In the late summer of 1845, the ships moved steadily westward through Baffin Bay. The sun still rose and set. The sea was cold but navigable. Whalers had traveled these waters for decades. The Franklin expedition was not entering an unknown ocean. It was following a route that others had survived. At first, progress was smooth. Sails filled when the wind allowed. When it did not, the steam engines were engaged carefully, their steady rhythm offering reassurance. The ships responded slowly but predictably. Ice floes drifted apart under pressure from hulls reinforced for precisely this purpose. The bows pressed forward. The water closed behind them. From the deck, the Arctic appeared expansive rather than hostile. The horizon stretched outward, broken only by distant ice and low, uneven clouds. There were moments of stillness, moments when the ships seemed to glide rather than force their way forward. These early impressions mattered. They reinforced the belief that the Arctic could be negotiated with patience and strength, that careful navigation would be enough. The cruise settled into routine quickly. Watches were kept as they always had been. Logs were written daily, recording position, weather, and ice conditions. Meals followed schedule. The chain of command remained intact. Life aboard the ships retained a sense of normalcy. This was important psychologically. Familiar structure provided reassurance in unfamiliar surroundings. As the ships moved deeper into the Canadian Arctic, the character of the ice began to change. Floes grew thicker. Leads, narrow channels of open water, became less predictable. Movement slowed. Navigation required constant adjustment. The ships no longer sailed in long, confident lines. They advanced in cautious increments, pausing, waiting, then moving again. The soundscape changed as well. Water lapping against the hull was replaced by a muted pressure. Ice rubbed against wood with a low, grinding sound. Not violent, but persistent. Still, there was no sense of crisis. This was the Arctic as expected. Officers observed carefully from the deck. Decisions were made methodically. When progress seemed uncertain, the ships waited. Waiting was not seen as failure. It was part of the process. The season dictated movement. Human schedules did not apply. As autumn approached, daylight shortened. The sun dipped lower each day, its warmth fading. Temperatures dropped gradually at first, then more sharply. Ice that had once drifted freely began to lock into place. Channels narrowed. Flows pressed together. The ship's movements became constrained. At this stage, wintering in the ice was not alarming. Previous expeditions had done so successfully. The practice was well understood. The ships were positioned carefully, their hulls aligned to reduce pressure. Snow was banked against the sides for insulation. Awnings and shelters were erected where needed. The crew prepared for the long Arctic night. Inside the ships, life adjusted. Heating systems were brought into regular use. Cabins warmed, damp clothing dried. The men settled into winter routines. Work continued, though at a slower pace. Maintenance tasks were performed. Scientific observations were recorded. Leisure became structured. Books were read aloud. Lectures were given. Games were played. Music filled the confined spaces, softening the silence outside. This period of early winter was often remembered by Arctic travelers as bearable, even pleasant in its own way. The hardship was real but manageable. The darkness, though long, was expected. What mattered was morale, and for a time morale held. The ships were secure. Supplies were ample. There was no immediate reason to believe that the ice would not release them when summer returned. The men trusted the cycle of seasons. But the Arctic does not always follow patterns. As weeks passed, it became clear that the ice was not loosening. Pressure built slowly around the hulls. Not enough to cause damage, but enough to prevent movement. The ships were no longer drifting. They were fixed in place. This immobility was subtle at first. Days passed without noticeable change, then weeks. The crew continued their routines, but an undercurrent of uncertainty began to form. Logs recorded ice conditions carefully. There was no dramatic entry, no declaration of concern, just observation. Winter deepened. Outside, the world simplified. Sky, ice, and darkness blended together. The horizon disappeared. Storms passed unseen, felt only as vibrations through the hull. Inside, the air grew heavy. Heating systems worked constantly, but moisture accumulated. Condensation formed on walls and ceilings. Metal fittings grew cold to the touch. Clothing dried slowly. Blankets remained damp. Illness appeared in small ways. Coughs, fatigue, minor infections. Nothing alarming at first. The men were accustomed to discomfort. As the sun vanished entirely, time took on a different quality. Days were marked by routine rather than light. Morning and evening lost their visual meaning. Psychological strain increased. This was not unique to the Franklin expedition. Every Arctic winter tested the mind as much as the body. The difference here was duration. By the time winter gave way to spring, the ice remained firm. Expectations began to shift. Summer was anticipated not as a gradual warming, but as a release. When it did not arrive as expected, uncertainty deepened. Ice began to fracture at the surface, but the deeper layers held. The ships remained locked. Efforts were made to free them. Men worked with saws and picks, cutting channels where possible. Progress was slow. Ice shifted unpredictably, sometimes closing newly opened spaces almost immediately. Steam engines were used cautiously, but fuel was conserved. Every decision weighed patience against risk. Still, there was no immediate crisis. Supplies remained sufficient. The ships were intact. The prevailing belief was that another winter might be required. This was not unprecedented, but each additional winter increased strain. Food, though plentiful, lacked variety. Canned provisions dominated meals. Fresh meat was rare. Hunting parties went out when conditions allowed, but success was limited. The physical effects of long-term Arctic living began to emerge. Weight loss, joint pain, fatigue that did not resolve with rest. Medical knowledge of the time struggled to explain these symptoms fully. The men continued to function, but not at full strength. As the second winter approached, the tone shifted subtly. Routines continued, but they carried more effort. Discipline held, but morale wavered. The ships, once symbols of security, now felt confining. Outside, the ice showed little intention of releasing its hold. Pressure ridges formed around the hulls, locking them further into place. The sound of ice grinding against wood became constant, not violent, just present. At some point, the idea of movement began to fade. The ships were no longer perceived as vessels waiting to sail. They were shelters. This mental shift was significant. It marked the transition from expedition to endurance. The men adjusted their expectations. The goal became survival rather than progress. This adjustment did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly through small decisions and quiet conversations. What mattered most was leadership. Order continued. Logs were kept, schedules maintained. But the margin for error shrank. Illness increased. Scurvy, long feared in polar travel, likely began to take hold despite efforts to prevent it. Weakness spread gradually. Wounds healed slowly. The environment outside remained indifferent. Spring and summer passed without freeing the ships. Ice loosened briefly, then tightened again. The ships shifted slightly, but did not escape. Each movement raised hope. Each pause eroded it. By the time the decision was made to abandon the ships, it was not sudden. It was the result of accumulated evidence. Food supplies were diminishing. Physical condition had declined. The ships, though intact, could no longer serve as a means of escape. Leaving them meant stepping into uncertainty. Staying meant waiting for a release that might never come. This decision would define the final phase of the expedition. But before it was made, there were months, perhaps years, of waiting, of watching the ice, of listening to its slow movements, of trusting, then doubting, the assumptions that had brought the expedition north. The journey into the ice had begun with confidence, with preparation, with belief in systems and strength. It did not end in chaos, it ended in stillness. A stillness so complete that movement itself became a memory. In that frozen quiet, the Arctic revealed its true nature, not as an adversary to be fought, but as an environment that does not adjust to human expectation. The ships had entered the ice willingly. Leaving it would require more than patience. It would require a choice that no one had wanted to make. And that choice, once made, would carry consequences that could not be undone. Waiting is rarely described as an action, yet in the Arctic it becomes one. It demands effort. It consumes attention. It reshapes time. By the point when the Franklin expedition fully understood that the ships were not going to be freed easily, waiting had already become their primary occupation. The ice was no longer something to be navigated around. It was something to live with. The ships lay embedded in the frozen sea, their hulls held fast by pressure that changed slowly, almost imperceptibly from day to day. There was no single moment when hope disappeared. Instead, hope thinned. At first, the men continued to speak of movement, of leads that might open, of winds that might shift the ice, of summer warmth that would arrive late, but arrive nonetheless. These expectations were not unreasonable. They were based on precedent. Other expeditions had waited through long winters and emerged intact. But the Arctic has a way of extending uncertainty. The first full year of immobility was endured with discipline. Routines held. The structure of naval life proved resilient. Every day was divided carefully. Men rose at set hours. Meals were taken together. Work parties were assigned tasks, even when there was little practical work to be done. The purpose of this structure was not efficiency. It was stability. Without routine, days blur together. Without markers, time loses shape. The officers understood this well. They enforced order not because it was productive, but because it was protective. Inside the ships, warmth was maintained as best as possible. Heating systems functioned, though imperfectly. Fuel was conserved, but not withheld. The interior spaces grew dimmer as winter deepened. Artificial light replaced sunlight entirely. Candles and oil lamps flickered against wooden walls. Shadows moved constantly. Outside, darkness settled completely. For months at a time, the sun did not rise. The world beyond the ships became a narrow field of snow and ice illuminated only by moonlight and stars. Storms passed unseen, known only through sound and vibration. This absence of visual change altered perception. Time slowed. Days felt longer, yet also indistinct. Men began to measure progress not in miles, but in meals eaten, in books read, in the slow wearing down of supplies. Food, once abundant, became a source of quiet calculation. Rations were sufficient on paper, but appetite changed in the cold. Monotony dulled desire. Canned meat and preserved vegetables filled the mess tables day after day. Fresh food was rare. When hunting parties were able to go out onto the ice or nearby land, success was uncertain. The environment offered little. Occasional seals or birds provided welcome variety, but not enough to change overall nutrition. The physical effects of long-term confinement began to appear gradually. Weight loss was common. Muscle weakened without regular exertion. Joints stiffened. Fatigue became persistent. Men who had once been energetic now moved more slowly. Tasks took longer. Rest did not fully restore strength. Medical understanding of the time struggled to explain these changes. Scurvy was a known danger, but prevention methods were inconsistent. Canned food was believed to protect against it. In practice, symptoms still emerged. Gums became tender. Wounds healed poorly. Bruising appeared without clear cause. These signs were not immediately catastrophic. They were subtle, easy to dismiss. The officers monitored health as best they could, but options were limited. Waiting magnified every small problem. Moisture accumulated inside the ships. Condensation from heating systems dampened walls and ceilings. Clothing dried slowly, if at all. Blankets retained a chill. Mold and mildew appeared in hidden corners. These were not life-threatening issues on their own, but they eroded comfort. And comfort mattered. Psychologically, the waiting was more taxing than any storm. There was no clear enemy, no event to respond to, only time. The men knew they were not progressing. They also knew that leaving the ships prematurely would be dangerous. The ships were shelter. They were warmth. They were familiarity. As long as they remained intact, they offered a measure of safety. This knowledge anchored decisions. Better to wait one more season. Better to conserve strength. Better not to gamble. As the second winter set in, the language around the expedition changed. The idea of when we continue quietly shifted to if we continue. This shift was rarely spoken aloud. It existed in tone rather than words. Logs remained formal. Official records did not express doubt. But in private conversations, uncertainty surfaced. The men were experienced sailors. They understood when conditions were unfavorable. They could feel the passage of time in their bodies. Waiting became heavier. Darkness returned, deeper than before. The novelty of winter. Routines wore thin. Lectures repeated. Books were reread. Music, once comforting, sometimes felt hollow. Silence pressed in during the long hours between scheduled activities. Sleep patterns changed. Some men slept too much. Others struggled with insomnia. Dreams were vivid, restless. The boundary between waking and sleeping blurred. Outside, the ice continued its slow, relentless movement. Pressure ridges formed and reformed around the ships. Occasional shifts caused the hulls to groan and creak. These sounds were unsettling, but not new. They reminded the crew that the environment was active, even when it appeared still. Maintenance became a daily effort. Ice had to be cleared from decks and rigging. Snow accumulation threatened to add weight and strain. Men worked in the cold, hands numbing quickly despite gloves. Injuries occurred more frequently. Small cuts, sprains. Each injury mattered more than it would have in warmer conditions. Recovery was slower. The sense of isolation deepened. There were no external signals, no contact with the outside world. The men knew that relief expeditions might be sent eventually, but they also knew that such efforts could take years. The Arctic was vast. Searches were uncertain. This knowledge was not emphasized. Hope, however abstract, remained necessary. Still, waiting reshaped priorities. Exploration ceased to be the primary goal. Survival took its place. Decisions were judged by whether they preserved strength rather than advanced position. This mindset was not defeatist. It was practical, but it also meant that time passed without resolution. Another summer came and went. The ice loosened briefly, shifting just enough to raise expectations. Then it tightened again. The ships moved inches, then stopped. Each minor change was watched closely, interpreted, debated. Was this the beginning of release, or just another false signal? The men learned not to celebrate prematurely. Disappointment was harder to recover from than patience. Health continued to decline. Illness spread more easily in confined spaces. Coughs lingered. Infections worsened. Medical supplies were finite. Treatments were limited. The officers did what they could. Morale became fragile. Small disagreements carried more weight. Irritations grew. The discipline of naval life prevented open conflict, but tension was present. Waiting stripped away distractions. It left men alone with their thoughts. For some, this meant reflection. For others, anxiety. Memories of home became sharper. Letters written but never sent accumulated. The idea of return grew abstract. Time, in this environment, did not move forward in a straight line. It looped. Each day resembled the last. Each decision deferred resolution. The ships themselves seemed to change character. Once symbols of progress and confidence, they now felt static. Their walls enclosed. Their spaces narrowed. The men knew every creak, every corner. Familiarity bred both comfort and confinement. The question of abandonment arose gradually. At first it was hypothetical. If the ice does not release us next season, if supplies diminish further, if health continues to decline. These thoughts were not official plans. They were mental rehearsals. The idea of leaving the ships was frightening. Outside lay open ice, uncertain terrain, and long distances. Inside lay shelter, however imperfect. The decision to stay was reinforced by every instinct toward safety. Yet safety was becoming relative. The ships could no longer carry the men to safety. They could only delay an outcome. Waiting, once protective, began to feel dangerous. This realization did not arrive suddenly. It emerged through accumulation, through the gradual wearing down of bodies and resolve, through the knowledge that another winter might be one too many. Still, no immediate action followed. The men waited. Because waiting was what they knew how to do. Because waiting required no irreversible choice. Because leaving meant stepping into a future with no shelter behind them. As months passed, the environment outside remained unchanged. Ice stretched in every direction. Land, when visible, was distant and uninviting. Navigation on foot would be slow and exhausting. The men were not ignorant of these realities. They understood what abandonment would mean. This understanding weighed heavily. Waiting became a burden carried collectively. Each man endured not only his own uncertainty, but that of those around him. Leadership, under these conditions, was a matter of maintaining cohesion. The officers continued to project calm. Orders were given, routines enforced. But authority could not change the ice. It could only manage response. In this prolonged stillness, the expedition crossed an invisible threshold. The possibility of success faded quietly into the background. The question was no longer whether the Northwest Passage would be found. It was whether the men would survive. Waiting had transformed the expedition from an exploration into an endurance trial. Not one defined by dramatic moments, but by attrition, by the slow erosion of strength, by the narrowing of options. The Arctic did not rush them. It did not force decisions. It simply remained. And in remaining, it asked the men to choose how long they would remain as well. The answer to that question would soon become unavoidable. But for now, the ships stayed where they were. The men stayed with them. And the waiting continued. There are moments when endurance quietly turns into risk. They do not announce themselves. They arrive without drama. For the men of the Franklin expedition, that moment came not with a storm or a sudden collapse, but with recognition. A gradual understanding that waiting, once the safest option, had become a danger of its own. The ships were still intact. The ice still held them. And the men, though weakened, were still alive. But the balance had shifted. The decision to abandon HMS Erebus and HMS Terror was not made lightly. It unfolded through observation rather than impulse. Health continued to decline. Strength did not return with the seasons. Supplies, though still present, no longer guaranteed survival. The ships could no longer carry the expedition forward. They had become stationary shelters in an environment that did not change. And shelter without movement was not enough. The idea of abandonment carried weight beyond logistics. To leave the ships was to leave certainty behind. The ships represented order. They were structured spaces governed by routine and familiarity. They held records, instruments, and the last tangible connection to Britain. Abandoning them meant stepping away from that structure into a landscape with no boundaries. The Arctic beyond the ships was open, exposed, and unforgiving. And yet remaining meant trusting in a future that had already failed to arrive. This dilemma defined the expedition's final phase. When the decision was made, it followed naval logic. Supplies that could be carried were prioritized. Essential equipment was selected carefully. Food, clothing, tools. What could not be carried was left behind. This process revealed the full weight of desperation. Men were forced to choose between objects that symbolized safety and those that offered practical utility. Libraries were abandoned. Scientific instruments were left in place. Personal items, letters, keepsakes, were discarded. Every choice reflected an attempt to balance memory against survival. The men prepared sledges to transport supplies across the ice. These sledges were heavy, loaded with food, boats, and equipment intended for river travel once land was reached. The terrain ahead was uncertain. Maps were incomplete. Distances were estimates. The plan, such as it was, involved moving south toward known outposts and trading routes. Somewhere beyond the ice, it was believed, help might be found. This belief was fragile. The men knew they were weakened. They knew the journey would be slow. But the alternative, remaining with the ships indefinitely, no longer seemed viable. When they finally stepped away from the vessels, the act itself was quiet. There was no ceremony, no recorded farewell. The ships were left standing in the ice, masts still upright, decks covered in snow. They appeared almost peaceful, as if waiting. For the men, the transition was immediate and harsh. Movement across ice was exhausting. Sledges resisted every step. The surface alternated between slick smoothness and jagged ridges. Progress was measured in small increments. Hours of effort produced little visible distance. Cold settled into muscles already weakened by months of inactivity. Breathing became labored. Hands numbed quickly. Rest periods were frequent, but rest offered limited recovery. The Arctic offered no level ground. Each step required attention. Falls were common. Injuries accumulated. What had once been a well-organized naval expedition now resembled a fragile line of men moving slowly across a hostile landscape. Morale fluctuated. At times, movement itself provided purpose. The act of leaving felt decisive. At other times, the enormity of the journey ahead overwhelmed any sense of progress. The men carried boats on their sledges, anticipating open water ahead. These boats added weight but represented hope. Rivers and coastlines might offer easier travel. They might lead to assistance. But reaching them required enduring terrain that seemed endless. Weather remained unpredictable. Wind cut through clothing. Snow reduced visibility. White blended into white. Direction became difficult to judge. Navigation relied on instruments that behaved erratically in the high Arctic. Fatigue impaired judgment. Mistakes became more likely. Food consumption increased with exertion. Rations, already limited, diminished more quickly than planned. Hunger became constant. Not sharp at first, but dull and persistent. The physical effects were compounded by illness. Symptoms worsened. Weakness deepened. Pain spread through joints and muscles. Scurvy, long feared, likely took hold more firmly now. Wounds opened and reopened. Bruises darkened. The body's ability to heal faltered. Despite this, the men continued. Turning back was no longer an option. The ships lay behind them, inaccessible. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was the only direction available. As days passed, desperation altered priorities. Survival instincts overrode discipline. The careful structure that had governed life aboard the ships dissolved. Hierarchy remained, but its influence weakened under physical strain. Decisions became reactive rather than planned. When a man fell, stopping was necessary. When supplies shifted, adjustments were made on the spot. The expedition's movement slowed further. At times it nearly stopped. The Arctic landscape offered little comfort. There were no trees, no shelter beyond what the men carried. Wind scoured the surface clean, exposing ice that reflected light painfully during brief daylight hours. When darkness returned, it felt absolute. Night camps were rudimentary. Shelter was limited to tents or makeshift windbreaks. Cold seeped in from every direction. Sleep was shallow. Dreams were restless. Morning brought stiffness rather than restoration. The men likely began to understand that their situation was becoming untenable. This understanding did not come all at once. It arrived in fragments, in the realization that strength was not returning, in the awareness that distances remained vast, in the quiet knowledge that some among them would not survive the journey. Evidence suggests that losses occurred gradually. Men fell behind. Some were unable to continue. Whether they were left deliberately or died where they fell is unclear. Records from this phase are scarce. What we know comes largely from later discoveries and Inuit oral histories. These accounts suggest scenes of profound desperation. Efforts to carry the sick and injured slowed the group further. At some point, the balance between compassion and survival became unbearable. Choices were made under conditions that left no room for judgment. Hunger intensified. Food became the central concern. Rations were stretched, portions reduced. Eventually, even these measures failed. The body, deprived of proper nutrition and rest, begins to fail in predictable ways. Decision-making suffers. Coordination declines. Desperation narrows focus to immediate needs. In such conditions, actions that would once have been unthinkable become conceivable. Evidence, found later, suggests that some of the men resorted to extreme measures in an effort to survive. These findings were deeply unsettling to Victorian sensibilities. They challenged the image of disciplined naval men maintaining order to the end. But desperation does not erase humanity. It reveals it under strain. The men of the Franklin expedition were not monsters. They were individuals pushed beyond the limits of endurance. The Arctic did not offer mercy. As the journey continued, the line between movement and collapse blurred. Progress became minimal. The goal, reaching safety, remained distant and abstract. What mattered from day to day was survival. Another step, another hour. Some men likely realized that they would not make it. What they felt in those moments is impossible to know. Fear, resignation, hope, perhaps all at once. The expedition, once a symbol of national confidence, now existed only as scattered groups moving through an indifferent landscape. The ships, left behind, faded into memory. They no longer represented safety. They became symbols of a choice already made. At some point, movement ceased entirely. Not because a decision was made, but because the body could go no further. The Arctic absorbed what remained. Snow covered tracks. Ice erased evidence. Silence returned. The abandonment of the ships marked the expedition's final transformation, from exploration to survival, from survival to desperation. This chapter of the story is not defined by failure of character, but by the limits of endurance. The men did not give up easily. They waited as long as waiting seemed possible. They moved when movement became necessary. They carried with them the expectations of a nation that believed preparation guaranteed success. In the end, preparation met a reality that did not bend. The Arctic did not respond to courage or experience. It remained what it had always been. And in that vast, frozen space, the Franklin expedition reached its quiet conclusion. Not with a single moment of collapse, but with a gradual fading. One step at a time. Long before European ships entered the Arctic, the region was already known, not as a blank space, not as an obstacle to be overcome. It was home. For generations, Inuit communities had lived within the rhythms of ice, wind, and seasonal darkness. They did not seek to master the Arctic. They sought to understand it well enough to live. This distinction shaped everything. Where European explorers approached the Arctic with maps and instruments, Inuit knowledge was carried through observation and memory. It was practical, adaptive, and deeply local. Ice was not a single condition. It had moods and stages. It formed, shifted, cracked, and healed. Snow was read by texture and sound, wind by direction and temperature. Survival depended not on resisting the environment, but on moving with it. When the Franklin expedition entered Inuit territory, this knowledge existed quietly alongside them. But it was not fully integrated into their planning. This was not due to hostility. It was due to assumption. European exploration culture prioritized written records and formal science. Knowledge passed orally, refined through daily practice, was often undervalued. The Arctic, in British thinking, was a place to be solved rather than listened to. As the expedition progressed, Inuit observers noticed signs of its presence. Strange ships appeared in waters not often traveled by Europeans. Smoke rose where none usually did. Tracks crossed ice in unfamiliar patterns. These observations were remembered. Years later, when search expeditions began to gather information, Inuit accounts would become crucial. But during the Franklin expedition itself, encounters were limited and uneven. Inuit communities were mobile, following seasonal patterns of hunting and fishing. European ships, fixed in the ice, were unlikely to cross paths easily. Still, contact did occur. Fragments of interaction are preserved through later testimony. Inuit hunters encountered small groups of men, traveling southward on foot. They observed their condition, their equipment, their movement. These observations were striking. The men were not traveling as Inuit would have. They carried heavy sledges over long distances, despite physical weakness. They wore clothing poorly suited for sustained Arctic travel. They followed rigid routes rather than adapting to terrain and weather. To Inuit eyes, this behavior appeared exhausting and dangerous. The Arctic rewards flexibility. It punishes rigidity. Inuit clothing was layered, designed to trap warmth while allowing moisture to escape. It was adjusted constantly, opened during exertion, sealed during rest. European wool and naval uniforms did not allow for such modulation. They became damp with sweat, then froze. This difference mattered. Shelter practices differed as well. Inuit built temporary structures quickly, using snow and available materials to create windbreaks and insulation. These shelters could be erected and abandoned with minimal effort. The men of the Franklin expedition relied on tents and carried equipment, heavier and slower to deploy. Food practices revealed another contrast. Inuit diets were adapted to scarcity and seasonality. Fresh meat, often consumed raw or lightly cooked, provided nutrients that preserved health. European rations, though plentiful at first, lacked this adaptability. Preserved foods sustained calories but not resilience. When Inuit later described the condition of the Franklin men, their accounts emphasized weakness. Men struggled to stand. They moved slowly. Some appeared confused. These descriptions were not judgmental. They were observational. To Inuit communities, survival in the Arctic required constant adjustment. Those who could not adjust declined quickly. One of the most important aspects of Inuit knowledge was an understanding of when not to travel. The Arctic presents brief windows of opportunity. Ice conditions shift rapidly. Travel at the wrong time can be fatal, regardless of strength or intention. European expeditions often operated on schedules determined far away, influenced by seasons as measured elsewhere. This mismatch created risk. When the Franklin men chose to abandon their ships and move south, they did so at great physical cost. Inuit observers noted this decision with concern. The route chosen required crossing ice and land that would have been avoided when possible. Alternative paths, known locally, might have offered better shelter or access to resources. But without shared knowledge, these options remained invisible. Later, search expeditions relied heavily on Inuit testimony. Years after the Franklin ships disappeared, British and American searchers sought information from Inuit communities along the Arctic coast. What they heard was unsettling. Stories of ships trapped in ice, of men dragging sledges, of bodies found far from the ships. These accounts were often dismissed initially. They conflicted with European expectations. They challenged the belief that disciplined naval men would behave in certain ways. But as physical evidence accumulated, Inuit knowledge proved remarkably consistent. Descriptions of locations matched discovered relics. Accounts of abandoned camps aligned with skeletal remains. What had once been overlooked became essential. Inuit knowledge was not abstract. It was precise. When asked about ice conditions, Inuit did not speak in generalities. They described specific behaviors. Which ice would support weight, which would fracture, which would drift. They knew how wind direction affected pressure, how tides influenced cracks. This information, had it been integrated earlier, might have altered decisions. But integration requires trust. Trust requires humility. The Franklin expedition, like many of its era, operated within a framework that assumed superiority of European methods. This assumption was rarely malicious. It was simply ingrained. Scientific instruments were trusted more than lived experience, written records more than oral memory. In the Arctic, this hierarchy did not hold. The environment did not privilege charts over observation. It responded only to adaptation. Inuit encounters with the Franklin expedition were brief and fragmentary, but their significance grew over time. They offered an alternative narrative, one that did not frame the expedition as a dramatic failure, but as a mismatch between approach and environment. Inuit communities understood that the Arctic could not be forced. They understood that survival depended on cooperation with conditions, not resistance. The men of the Franklin expedition were skilled sailors and disciplined officers. They were not ignorant, but they were operating within assumptions that limited their options. Inuit knowledge represented a different relationship with the Arctic, one shaped by generations of trial and adjustment. It emphasized mobility over permanence, lightness over accumulation, observation over control. These principles stood in contrast to the expedition's reliance on ships, supplies, and schedules. When Inuit later guided searchers to relics and sites, they did so without expectation of recognition. Their knowledge was shared because it was useful, because it was accurate. Over time, historians began to recognize the importance of these contributions. The story of the Franklin expedition could not be told fully without them. Inuit accounts provided context for actions that otherwise seemed irrational. Why men traveled when they did, why they carried certain items, why they appeared to move against local advice. These details transformed interpretation. They shifted focus from moral judgment to environmental understanding. The Franklin expedition did not fail because its men lacked courage or discipline. It faltered because it relied on a model of exploration that was poorly suited to the Arctic. Inuit knowledge revealed this gently, not through critique, but through contrast. Through the simple fact that Inuit communities survived where others did not. They survived not by conquering the Arctic, but by belonging to it. In this way, Inuit encounters with the Franklin expedition serve as a quiet counterpoint. They remind us that knowledge is not always written down, that expertise does not always wear uniforms or carry instruments. Sometimes it is carried in memory, in practice, in attention to small changes. The Arctic speaks softly. Those who listen closely can live within it. Those who do not may never hear its warnings. By the time European searchers fully appreciated the value of Inuit knowledge, the Franklin expedition was already lost. But its story, reshaped by these encounters, gained depth. It became not only a tale of endurance and loss, but a lesson in humility. A reminder that survival depends not only on preparation, but on the willingness to learn from those who know a place best. In the Arctic, knowledge is not abstract, it is life itself. And in the long silence that followed the Franklin expedition, Inuit voices ensured that the story did not disappear entirely. They preserved its outline. They gave it shape. They allowed it to be understood, not as a mystery of failure alone, but as a meeting of worlds that never fully aligned. When the Franklin expedition did not return, silence was not immediately alarming. Arctic voyages were expected to disappear from view for years at a time. No news in itself meant little, but as seasons passed and nothing was heard, concern slowly hardened into resolve. Families waited. Officials hesitated. Then, reluctantly at first, the machinery of search began to turn. The first efforts were cautious. They assumed delay rather than disaster. Relief ships were sent along likely routes, instructed to look for signs of winter camps or messages left behind. These early searches were limited in scope and optimistic in tone. They returned empty-handed. As years passed, optimism thinned. Each failed search reframed the problem. What had once been delay now looked increasingly like disappearance. Public attention grew. Newspapers followed every development closely. Illustrations imagined ships locked heroically in ice, crews surviving against the odds. The absence of concrete information allowed imagination to fill the gaps. The Arctic became a canvas onto which hope and fear were projected. Government-sponsored expeditions increased in number. Ships approached the Arctic from multiple directions, through Baffin Bay, from the Pacific, across overland routes. Each followed a different hypothesis. Perhaps Franklin had succeeded and emerged elsewhere. Perhaps the ships had wintered farther west. Perhaps they had found shelter on land. The search itself became an extension of the age of exploration. Crews endured the same hardships as the men they sought. They waded through winters. They mapped coastlines. They recorded ice conditions. And slowly they began to find things. Not answers. fragments, a piece of wood with markings, an abandoned campfire, a scrap of clothing. Each object carried weight far beyond its physical size. These finds confirmed something essential. The expedition had progressed farther than initially feared, but they also deepened uncertainty. Why had these items been left behind? Under what conditions? The most important early discovery came years after the ships had vanished. A note preserved in a stone cairn. Written on official naval paper, it was brief and formal. It recorded that the ships had wintered in the ice and that all was, at that time, well. A later edition, written in a different hand, told a darker story. The ships had been abandoned. The commander was dead. The men were attempting to march south. This single document reshaped understanding. It was the first confirmation that abandonment had occurred. It provided dates. It established a sequence of events, but it raised far more questions than it answered. Why had the ships been abandoned? What conditions had forced that decision? How many men were still alive? Searchers adjusted their focus. Attention shifted from the ships to land routes. If the men had marched south, they might have left trails, camps, equipment, graves. Search expeditions began combing coastlines and inland routes with renewed urgency. This work was painstaking. The Arctic does not preserve tracks easily. Snow erases quickly. Ice moves. Years can pass between an event and its discovery. When remains were found, they were often scattered. Bones bleached by exposure. Clothing shredded by time and weather. Each find required careful interpretation. Position mattered. Orientation mattered. Were the remains near known routes? Were they associated with equipment? Slowly, patterns emerged. Searchers began to understand the scale of the tragedy. Bodies were found far from the ships, some near the coast, others inland. This suggested prolonged movement rather than a single collapse. The men had traveled, and traveled far. Items recovered alongside remains revealed troubling details. Heavy objects, silverware, books, even furniture fragments, were found miles from the ships. These were not practical items for survival. Their presence suggested confusion, desperation, or adherence to naval discipline beyond reason. Why would starving men carry such weight? This question haunted Victorian observers. To them, it suggested a breakdown of judgment. To modern eyes, it suggests something quieter. Habit, routine, the instinct to preserve order when everything else is dissolving. Search expeditions relied increasingly on Inuit testimony. Communities along the Arctic coast shared stories passed down through memory. They spoke of ships trapped in ice, of men pulling sledges, of camps abandoned. They pointed to places where bodies had been found long ago. At first, these accounts were treated with skepticism. They did not align neatly with European expectations. But as physical evidence accumulated, the consistency of Inuit descriptions became impossible to ignore. Searchers followed their guidance. They found what had been described. This collaboration marked a shift. For the first time, Inuit knowledge was treated not as supplementary, but as central. Even then, the search did not bring closure. The ships themselves remained missing. They were assumed destroyed, crushed by ice, sunk beyond reach. This assumption held for over a century. During this time, the Franklin expedition took on a symbolic life of its own. It became a story retold and reshaped, a warning about hubris, a testament to endurance, a mystery without resolution. Writers speculated. Artists imagined final scenes. The lack of definitive answers allowed interpretation to flourish. Scientific theories emerged: lead poisoning from canned food, botulism, scurvy, starvation. Each theory offered partial explanation. None accounted fully for every detail. Bones examined in the late 20th century revealed signs of malnutrition. Some showed cut marks. These findings were deeply uncomfortable. They suggested that, in extreme conditions, the men had taken desperate measures to survive. Victorian audiences recoiled from this idea. Modern audiences approached it differently. With distance, it became easier to view such actions without moral outrage. Desperation strips away social rules. It reveals the body's insistence on survival. Still, many questions remained unanswered. Where exactly had the ships ended? What condition were they in when abandoned? How long had men survived after leaving them? For decades, these questions lingered without resolution. Then, slowly, technology changed the search. Advances in sonar and underwater exploration reopened possibilities. The Arctic, once inaccessible beneath ice, became navigable in new ways. Search teams returned with renewed purpose. They combined historical records, Inuit knowledge, and modern tools. The effort was patient. Years passed between attempts. Then, finally, one of the ships was found, resting beneath cold, dark water, preserved by the Arctic's slow decay. The discovery was quiet. There was no dramatic revelation. The ship lay as it had been left, its structure intact, its decks settled. It did not answer every question, but it confirmed something essential. The expedition had not ended in a single catastrophe. It had unfolded slowly through decisions made under pressure, through waiting, movement, and exhaustion. Later, the second ship was found as well. Together, they framed the final phase of the expedition. They showed that the ships had endured longer than expected. They suggested attempts to reoccupy or reposition them. These findings complicated earlier assumptions. The story grew richer, but not simpler. Each discovery clarified one detail and blurred another. This is the nature of historical search. The Arctic preserves, but it also obscures. Cold slows decay, but ice hides evidence. Even now, large parts of the story remain unknowable. We can reconstruct movements. We can infer conditions. But we cannot access thoughts. We cannot know the precise reasoning behind each decision. What the search expeditions ultimately revealed was not a neat narrative, but a layered one. The Franklin expedition did not fail at a single point. It unraveled, and the search for it mirrored that unraveling. It progressed through patience rather than breakthrough, through accumulation rather than revelation. Each clue mattered: a note in a cairn, a bone on the shore, a ship beneath the ice. Together, they formed a picture defined by absence as much as presence. The search expeditions also transformed understanding of the Arctic itself. They exposed the limits of European exploration models. They highlighted the value of indigenous knowledge. They forced a reckoning with assumptions about progress and control. In seeking Franklin, searchers learned as much about themselves as about the missing men. They learned that certainty is fragile, that preparation does not guarantee outcome, that environments have agency. The Arctic did not conceal the expedition out of malice. It simply remained indifferent, and in that indifference, human plans dissolved. The search expeditions, spanning decades and generations, did not bring the men home, but they brought understanding. Not complete, not comforting, but honest. They revealed a story shaped not by dramatic failure, but by slow erosion. of strength, of options, of certainty. And in doing so, they ensured that the Franklin expedition would not disappear entirely into the ice. Its traces remain, not as a solved mystery, but as a quiet lesson, one written across frozen shores, scattered camps, and ships resting in cold water, waiting, as the Arctic has always waited, in silence. When the last search ships returned and the final Victorian expeditions withdrew from the Arctic, the Franklin expedition passed from lived memory into history. What remained were fragments, notes, bones, stories. For many decades, these fragments were interpreted through the lens of the 19th century. Explanations focused on endurance and moral character, on courage tested beyond its limits. But as time passed, new tools emerged, tools that allowed questions to be asked differently. Modern science did not arrive in the Arctic with a single revelation. It arrived gradually, revisiting old evidence with fresh methods and fewer assumptions. The goal was not to assign blame. It was to understand process. One of the earliest scientific explanations to gain attention involved lead. The Franklin expedition had carried thousands of tins of preserved food, sealed with lead-based solder. At the time, this was considered safe. Canning was a recent innovation. Its risks were not fully understood. In the late 20th century, researchers began to analyze bones recovered from expedition sites. Using chemical analysis, they measured trace elements preserved within the remains. The results were striking. Some bones contained elevated levels of lead. This finding suggested chronic exposure. Lead, in sufficient quantities, can impair cognitive function. It can weaken the body. It can affect judgment, coordination, and mood. The idea that lead poisoning contributed to the expedition's collapse gained attention quickly. It offered an explanation that fit several observations. Confusion, poor decision-making, physical decline. If the men had been slowly poisoned by their own supplies, endurance alone would not have saved them. However, the lead theory was not conclusive. Further research complicated the picture. Lead was present in many 19th century environments. Water pipes, cookware, and other sources could contribute. Some studies suggested that lead levels found in the Franklin remains were comparable to those in other populations of the era. This did not eliminate lead as a factor, but it reduced its explanatory power. Rather than a single cause, lead exposure became one element in a broader web. Attention then turned to nutrition. Scurvy had haunted polar expeditions for centuries. Caused by vitamin C deficiency, it weakens connective tissue, impairs healing, and leads to fatigue and pain. The Franklin expedition had attempted to guard against scurvy through preserved foods and lime juice, but preservation processes often destroyed vitamin content. Canned vegetables, though calorically sufficient, lacked essential nutrients. Fresh meat, which Inuit diets relied upon, was rare for the expedition. Modern analysis of remains showed signs consistent with scurvy. Bone lesions, poor healing. Scurvy alone would not have caused immediate death. But combined with cold, exertion, and starvation, it would have significantly reduced resilience. Starvation itself became another area of focus. Caloric needs in extreme cold increase dramatically. Dragging heavy sledges across ice requires immense energy. Rations that seemed adequate on paper may have been insufficient in practice. Hunger, even when not absolute, degrades physical and mental capacity. It reduces strength. It narrows attention. It accelerates decline. Evidence from recovered camps suggested that food supplies diminished rapidly after the ships were abandoned. The men may have miscalculated how far rations would stretch, or they may have been forced to consume more than planned simply to keep moving. Cold exposure compounded every other problem. Extreme cold constricts blood vessels, reducing circulation to extremities. It increases risk of frostbite and hypothermia. Even when not immediately fatal, cold exhausts the body. Sleep becomes shallow. Recovery slows. In such conditions, minor injuries become serious. Modern physiology helps explain why the men weakened so quickly once they left the ships. Shelter had provided a buffer. Without it, the environment asserted itself fully. Another area of scientific inquiry focused on disease. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and other infections were common in the 19th century. Crowded living conditions aboard ships would have facilitated spread. Once illness took hold, the Arctic offered no means of recovery. Antibiotics did not exist. Medical interventions were limited. Even a minor respiratory infection could become fatal under sustained cold stress. Some researchers have suggested botulism as a possible factor, linked to improperly sealed canned food. Botulism can cause paralysis and death. However, evidence for widespread botulism among the crew remains limited. It remains a possibility rather than a conclusion. Perhaps the most sensitive area of modern investigation involves evidence of cannibalism. Cut marks on bones, consistent with tool use, were identified on some remains. These findings were disturbing to early researchers and to the public. They challenged deeply held notions of naval discipline and Victorian morality. Yet, from a scientific perspective, they required careful interpretation. Cut marks do not speak to motive or circumstance. They indicate action under extreme conditions. Modern anthropology approaches such evidence without moral judgment. In situations of starvation, the human body prioritizes survival. Social rules, learned behaviors, and taboos lose their force. The presence of cannibalism does not imply savagery. It implies desperation. This understanding reframed the narrative. Rather than a story of collapse into chaos, the Franklin expedition began to look like a prolonged struggle against compounding stressors. No single factor was sufficient on its own. Lead exposure may have impaired judgment. Scurvy weakened bodies. Starvation drained energy. Cold magnified every weakness. Together, these forces created a situation from which recovery was unlikely. Modern archaeology added further nuance. The discovery of the ships themselves revealed details that written records could not. Their positions suggested attempts at repositioning after initial abandonment. This implied that not all decisions followed a single plan. Some men may have returned to the ships. Some may have hoped to use them again. This back and forth suggests uncertainty rather than a fixed strategy. The expedition's final phase was not a straight march toward safety. It was a series of adjustments. Modern theory increasingly emphasizes this fluidity. Rather than imagining a single moment of failure, researchers see a chain of responses. Each decision made sense in isolation. Each choice narrowed future options. This is how complex systems fail, not through one error, but through accumulation. Environmental science also reshaped interpretation. Ice core data and historical climate records suggest that the mid-19th century included particularly severe Arctic conditions. Colder summers. Persistent ice. If true, this would have reduced the likelihood of seasonal release. The Franklin expedition may have encountered an Arctic less forgiving than average. This context matters. It suggests that even a well-prepared expedition could have been overwhelmed by conditions beyond expectation. Modern psychology contributes as well. Studies of prolonged isolation and confinement reveal predictable patterns: cognitive fatigue, reduced motivation, impaired problem-solving. The men aboard the ships endured years of darkness and monotony. Such conditions erode adaptability. They make it harder to reassess plans. They encourage persistence even when persistence is no longer optimal. This insight aligns with observed behavior. Waiting continued longer than may have been wise. Movement began when bodies were already weakened. These were not failures of character. They were human responses to sustained stress. Perhaps the most important contribution of modern science is perspective. It moves the story away from judgment and toward understanding. It allows the Franklin expedition to be seen not as a cautionary tale of arrogance, but as an encounter between human systems and an environment that resists simplification. Modern theories do not compete so much as they complement one another. Each addresses part of the picture. Together, they suggest that the expedition's fate was not sealed by one flaw. It was shaped by interaction between technology and environment, between planning and variability, between expectation and reality. Even today, research continues. New techniques analyze isotopes, trace elements, and micro-wear patterns. Each study refines understanding incrementally, but complete certainty remains out of reach, and perhaps that is appropriate. The Franklin expedition unfolded in a place defined by uncertainty. Its story resists tidy conclusions. Modern science does not solve the mystery so much as soften it. It replaces dramatic speculation with measured insight. It allows space for complexity. In the end, what science reveals most clearly is not the precise cause of death for each man, but the fragility of human systems under sustained strain. Preparation matters. Experience matters, but adaptability matters most. The Arctic did not defeat the Franklin expedition in a single blow. It wore it down. Modern science, patient and precise, mirrors that process. It does not deliver answers all at once. It accumulates them, quietly, over time. As the story of the Franklin expedition fades from documented events into quiet aftermath, what remains is not a single conclusion, but a lingering stillness. The Arctic has a way of holding silence. Ice drifts back into place. Snow covers tracks. Wind smooths what was once disturbed. In time, even the memory of movement disappears. For the men who set out aboard HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, there was no final moment witnessed by the world. No closing scene recorded in ink. Their story ended gradually, step by step, breath by breath, as the Arctic absorbed what remained. This absence of a clear ending can feel unsettling. We are accustomed to narratives that resolve cleanly. Victories, defeats. The Franklin expedition offers neither. Instead, it offers something quieter, a reminder of scale. The Arctic does not respond to ambition or intention. It does not hurry to meet human schedules. It does not soften itself for experience or preparation. It simply remains. In that vastness, the men of the expedition were not villains or fools. They were not symbols of arrogance alone. They were human beings working within the limits of what they knew. They trusted in systems that had worked before. They relied on technology that represented progress in their time. They endured longer than many could. What failed was not courage. What failed was compatibility. The Arctic requires a different relationship, one built on listening rather than control, on adaptation rather than resistance. This lesson was not fully understood in the 19th century. It has been learned slowly through repetition and loss. The Franklin expedition became part of that learning. Its traces, notes in cairns, scattered equipment, ships resting beneath cold water, are not warnings carved in stone. They are quiet markers. They remind us that preparation, no matter how thorough, cannot account for every variable. That endurance, no matter how strong, has limits, and that environments shaped over millennia do not bend quickly to human will. There is a tendency to search for blame in stories like this, to identify a single mistake, a single decision. Modern science shows us that no such moment exists here. The expedition did not collapse suddenly. It narrowed. Options closed. Strength declined. Waiting became dangerous. Movement became desperate. Each step followed logically from the one before. This is often how real histories unfold, not as dramatic failures, but as accumulations. The Arctic in this story is not an enemy. It is indifferent. Indifference can feel cruel, but it is not malicious. It simply does not prioritize human survival. For Inuit communities, this indifference was understood and respected. Survival came through adjustment, through attention to subtle changes, through flexibility. The Franklin expedition carried a different inheritance, one shaped by order, discipline, and confidence in systems. Neither approach is inherently wrong, but in this environment, one proved insufficient. Today, the story of the Franklin expedition continues to evolve. New discoveries add detail. New interpretations offer nuance, but the core remains unchanged. A group of men entered the Arctic believing they could pass through it. They found instead a place that demanded patience beyond expectation. Their story does not ask us to judge them harshly. It asks us to consider limits, the limits of knowledge, the limits of planning, the limits of endurance. These are not weaknesses, they are conditions of being human. As listeners, we encounter this story from a distance. We sit in warm rooms. We listen without hunger or cold. This distance allows reflection. It allows us to see the Franklin expedition not as a failure to be explained away, but as an experience that reveals something enduring about the relationship between people and place. In the end, the Arctic did not claim the men through violence, claimed them through time, through waiting that extended too long, through cold that seeped slowly inward, through decisions made carefully, yet under constraints that grew narrower with each passing season. The ships, once symbols of confidence and progress, now rest quietly beneath the water. They are preserved not as monuments but as witnesses. They tell no story aloud, they simply remain. And perhaps that is fitting. The Franklin expedition does not demand resolution. It invites stillness. A pause. A recognition that some histories are not meant to be solved completely. They are meant to be sat with. If you've listened this far, you've already done what the Arctic quietly requires. You've slowed down. You've allowed the story to unfold without rushing to a conclusion. There is no urgency here. Only reflection, only the sense of a vast place, unchanged, holding the memory of those who passed through it. As this story settles, you might let it drift away, like ice returning to still water, like footsteps erased by snow. You can rest now. The Arctic will remain, silent, patient, unmoved. And the story, once told, can finally be allowed to sleep.